So, for reasons I'm not quite sure of, I sense that somehow I didn't have an argument that unfolded at the second hour last week. So I want to see if I can really get a string that's going to give us an account of the meaning of self-consciousness in general today, and we'll see how it goes. To repeat, or I think I'm repeating, I kind of lost track of where the claim of the master-slave dialectic is that we only become truly self-conscious, or self-consciousness only begins to become explicit in a moment of radical fear. Only in the confrontation with a threat that forces us to overcome our relationship to the natural world can we achieve a truly human orientation towards ourselves and the world. Or to put the same point another way, what is at stake in the first instance is overcoming the authority of nature. And the theme of how we overcome the authority of nature, which I take to be the meaning of subjectivity. That is, I take the two things to be coextensive. That is, the surrender of the authority of nature, natural desire, and the institution of self-consciousness as our authoritative relationship to the world are equivalent terms. And that this thought of this uprooting of the self in a violent moment as the condition for becoming self-consciousness is, as I think I suggested, a theme throughout modern philosophy. I suggested that that theme first becomes apparent in Descartes in the moment of the evil demon. The evil demon is someone who is threatening the authority of the subject, threatening their natural teachings, threatening their relationship to the world, threatening what they can trust and not trust, until that moment where they must give up everything and discover the cogito. So it's only in a moment of terrible threat where the self is forced to give up everything that it becomes self-conscious. It says, I think. It says, I. It says, I only under the exigency of terror. And that moment is repeated in Hobbes. And although we think of Hobbes the materialist and Descartes the idealist, it's important to note that when, I guess it was The Behemoth, was published anonymously, a lot of people attributed it to Descartes. That is, it...
Apparently they met.
Yeah, I mean, and so that the Descartes, Hobbes were thought to be doing something similar. And of course, in Hobbes, it is the same thing. The whole point of the state of nature, right, is to put the self with its natural desires and natural beliefs into a situation in which they pursue them naturally. And if they pursue them naturally with their natural beliefs, right, there is a war of all against all in which they must then give up those natural beliefs and take on a different standpoint, the standpoint of politics. Politics emerges as a moment of coming to self-consciousness. The face-to-face with the other who wants nothing but my death tells me I'd better have a policeman around. So both Descartes and Hobbes begin by treating the individual as a self-interested, egoistic agent. And what Descartes achieves through a method of doubt, Hobbes achieves through a phenomenology of doubt. That is, the state of nature is a mechanism to bring about doubt. Doubt being about the belief that if I can succeed in my endeavors, that's what's wrong, that's our natural vanity, that's the sin of pride. That is, we are forgetful of death. We are forgetful of death. And the Leviathan, as a text, I believe, is itself meant to be, I can argue about your text, but I think the actual text is meant to be, remember death. That's what I think the text is, a memento mori. And it was meant to be that in the situation of the Civil War. Right? And divided parliaments and all that. We can tell the story about how. So Hegel is taking up this theme, but this theme, you may say, goes back as far as Plato. After all, Plato says that those little denizens sitting in the cave, happily watching the shadows, have to be torn away. They don't want to stop watching the shadows, and they have to be torn, ripped out of the cave, and dragged out into the sunlight. Why this violence? Why this violence? Same thought. What is the cave? The cave is the authority of nature. The teaching that things are as they appear to be, the truth of semblance. In the basement of this work, there's a wonderful PhD written here by Richard Kennington on Descartes' teaching of nature. And it will tell you how much of the structure of Descartes' meditations is about how we have the teaching of nature is, this is what Descartes is struggling with, things are as they appear to be. And that actually is just false. That's why we have to give up that teaching of nature. So things aren't as they appear to be. Things are actually made up of invisible corpuscles. That's what Descartes thought, right? He really thought the world was written in the language of mathematics. So fear of death creates self-consciousness. Again, Kant's moral law. The moral law is supposed to sting my vanity. It's supposed to humble me. It's supposed to threaten me. It's supposed to be awesome and sublime. And its sublimity is necessary because I need to be again shaken out of my natural desires. And of course I also have something to attain, right? The moral law is also again both superego and ego ideal. Always those two roles in one. Hegel is trying to work out the meaning of that claim about subjectivity. The meaning of subjectivity is the overcoming of the authority of nature. And we attain that in a moment of radical fear. And we come to a moment of self-consciousness. And self-consciousness is, and I'll say a lot more about this in about 40 minutes, the meaning of self-consciousness is the origin of a second spring of action. A second spring of action. I mean by that, nothing complicated. It's Platonic thought. One spring of action we know. Natural desires. They move us to action. I desire something, I do it. What all of these characters are trying to suggest is there is a second spring of action, called reason. Plato calls them ideas. For Hobbes, it remains instrumental reason, but the difference between the beginning and the end is the difference between short-term and long-term instrumental reasoning in Hobbes.
Fear is reason for Hobbes.
What?
Fear is reason.
Fear is, well, yes, fear is reason. I mean, but for all of them, I think it's reason. So we have to come about a second meaning or a second origin, a second formation, a second source of something that moves us to action other than natural desires, other than those desires we are given with. And the question is, where do they come from? How do we develop them? What do they mean? And no one actually answered these questions, I think, prior to Hegel. That's my claim. No one actually answers this question prior to Hegel. They all go for a Platonic story, that there is this other realm, the moral law, the laws of reason, even in Hobbes, in Descartes, the ideas. No one has an account of the origin of reason, shall we say, in the meaning of reason. And that's what I believe Hegel is after. And he thinks that, again, has something to do with the very idea of self-consciousness, of being self-aware in the appropriate way. Okay. So, to be... Yeah, please. Sure.
Aren't you using reason in the phenomenology before you get to self-consciousness? I mean, isn't it reason if you say, the blackboard is black or something? Isn't that reason already? Or that's not reason, but I mean, aren't you using reason? I mean, it seems to me that reason and self-consciousness are not the same. And why does reason necessitate self-consciousness? It seems to me
because what we
add something to reason.
Right. It's authority. From the moment of perception, we start using reason in the sense that we start using universals, and we start manipulating things in accordance. And in science, we're obviously reasoning. What we don't have any understanding of is the authority of reason. Reason is out there. Right? It's realism. Reason, moved to self-consciousness, is our self-determination. So this is how we discover the authority of reason. It's not reason itself, but the authority of reason. So we're overcoming the authority of nature and moving to the authority of reason. So exactly the right question. Yeah. Okay. So we learned that to be a self-conscious agent, it is necessary to be a living agent and to be aware of oneself as a living agent, which is why the original battle for independence is self-defeating. Life is a necessary condition for self-consciousness. But the idea of the battle, that it is a necessary condition for self-consciousness because it reveals something about, or the beginning of the meaning of norms themselves. That is, the very idea of norms, or values, or reason, is that it is the sort of thing that can trump natural desires and inclinations. That is, ask us to give them up. We cannot be self-conscious agents unless we operate according to norms for which we are willing to sacrifice our lives. And hence we generate a double characterization of natural life and death and spiritual life and death. So in order to preserve its natural life, the slave accepts spiritual death. It gives up the hope of independence. It gives up its idea that it is self-determining, it is determined by the other. The master, we saw, is someone who, because he is willing to die, he believes he attains spiritual life. That is the authority of self-consciousness, the self or selfhood, apart from the authority of nature. Of course, all that's false, because they are bound together. Nonetheless, the slave sacrifices spiritual recognition for staying alive. That is what makes the slave a slave. And both the future master and the future slave come to recognize that life is necessary, and hence they must be in relationship to one another. We further saw last week that the position of the master is non-dynamic, that it goes nowhere, that the master, in a sense, returns to the position of a natural being for two reasons, maybe three, at least for a couple of reasons. First, of course, the truth of the master is a master because he has a slave. That is, he is recognized by a being he does not recognize. Hence, he is recognized by a thing. So, in some sense, he is reduced to the very thinghood he disdains. Secondly, he returns to a self-identity because he does not act. He simply consumes. He consumes whatever he desires because the slave gives it to him. But because all he does is consume or die, that's all masters do, then there's nowhere for the master to go. Which is to say, the very position of mastery is non-dynamic. It has no possibility of learning, transformation. Learning and transformation. So Hegel wants to introduce an account by saying, and here's the interesting thought, we enter into the battle, the struggle for life and death, in order to attain independence. It turns out that freedom cannot be won immediately. Freedom is not something you possess the way you might possess a watch. Freedom is an accomplishment of an elaborate process. And I'll say how elaborate it is in a moment. But it is something that is not given. It is a result. And it's a result of a complex set of transformations in social relations. Already now freedom is becoming odd, because I can't attain freedom by asserting my absolute independence. So my freedom is not being absolutely independent. Rather, freedom is a condition of the right kind of dependence. Which sounds like a contradiction in terms. But that, of course, is the core Hegelian thought, that freedom is going to be finding the formation of my relationship to another that is not self-defeating, but emancipating. We have no idea what that is. Neither do the master-slave, and there's no easy way to find it. So the question is, how is the intersubjective relation between master and slave going to be made into a dynamic process? What is required is for it to be a process which allows for, remember I said that it's all about the authority of nature, which allows for the continual overcoming of nature within and without. And I think if we had, rather than history of recognition as it is for Hegel, we could better say that history is the process of overcoming nature within and without. Makes it sound a lot like Marx. It should. He didn't base his entire work on this section for nothing. Right? So this is get the structure going. Okay. Hegel put forward two ineliminable conditions for the achievement of self-consciousness: fear of death and service, work for another. First, fear of death, paragraph 194. Middle of the paragraph, maybe about a third of the way down. For this consciousness has been fearful not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments, but its whole being has been seized with dread. In that experience, it has been quite unmanned, has trembled in every fiber of its being, and everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundation. But this pure, universal movement, the absolute melting away of everything stable, is the simple, essential nature of self-consciousness. This movement of everything stable being dissolved into nothingness is the essential, simple movement of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for self, which consequently is implicit, notice implicit, in this consciousness. This moment of pure being for self is also explicit for the bondsman, for in the Lord it exists as his object. Okay. So this is what I've tried to begin diagramming on the board here. So we're talking about something like an original trauma, or maybe an original castration. Anyway, the question is, how are we to overcome the attitude, let's call it the natural attitude, which takes any givens within ourselves or within external nature as givens that cannot be altered. Think of everyone who lives in Iowa. It's all just the way it is, right? Nothing's ever going to change. We don't want it to change. It is what it is. Okay. What's going to make Iowa change? Hegel's answer is that only the fear of death makes everything stable and solid appear not to be so. And what he means by this is that we don't know what is transformable and what not. We don't know what we can change or not, what we can do or not, until we are put to the test. Until we are faced with necessity. Only necessity challenges the authority of settled desires, habits, customs, and the like. So that but we need a fear of death that is, we need a fear of death that is not sporadic. We need a conception of the fear of death that has a structure to it. So we need an account of the fear of death in which that experience of fear, that is, a willingness to give up anything and everything, becomes itself a settled disposition. That's what the master-slave relationship is. It is the institution of the fear of death. So when Hegel says that this moment of being for self is also explicit in the bondsman, for in the Lord it exists as his object, it is now the Lord himself who is death. That's what mastery means to the slave. Mastery means you must give up everything or die. You must surrender everything to me or die. So Hegel says the absolute fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The Lord is death. So, for Hegel, the fear of death is given structure, is given stability, and is given objective form in the person and the presence of the master, and that therefore the institution of slavery, and it's an institution, indeed it's the first institution, it's the idea of institution itself, it is the institutionality of there being institutions whatsoever. Lucanians will call it the law of the Father. In the person and presence of the master. So with the experience of slavery, the fear of death is socialized. It becomes incorporated into a social relation capable of indefinite historical mutation. The social relation can take on any number of possible forms. It can be social, economic, or political. It may exist between individual persons, or groups of persons, or classes or nations. Structure would be the same. That's what Marx wanted out of the relationship between bourgeois and proletarian. Exactly that. Hence, it is only with the socialization that the fear of death can become efficacious in shaping attitudes and activities. And it's this institution that is going to then lead to the structure ironically, of human self-creation. Why? Because the first thing and the most prominent thing about the meaning of the socialization of the fear of death is it is equivalent to the socialization of the repression of natural desire. As what it is fundamentally to be a slave is to be willing to give up all your natural desires. And further, not only to give up all your natural desires, but obviously to act only on the desires of another. This is a strange kind of being to be a master and a slave. The slave is someone who acts on the desires of another and therefore does actions that are not his actions but the actions of another. And the slave is the body of the master. So it's as if the master-slave relationship is a kind of Cartesian dualism, where the master is a kind of mind and the slave is a kind of body. And they are related in this social relation of mutual dependency. So the risk of life in the battle for recognition token the dismissal of the drive for self-preservation. That moment, I argued, is gratuitous and unprecedented. It marks the transition point between the world of needs and drives on the one hand and what I'll call the world of desire on the other. The natural world is splintered with the demand for independence. Need becomes desire when the object of consciousness itself possesses spiritual autonomy. So initially then, it is the desire for independence which is transformed. But through the standing fear of death represented by the presence of the master, by the institution of the master-slave relation, all desires become subject to repression. Since no desire that I have can be taken for granted, then every desire I have is subject to reflective evaluation. Social accreditation, legitimation, or repression. So, what I'm trying to get to here is this thought that we must give up the idea that what it means to give up the authority of nature is to give up the idea that to have a desire is to have a reason for action. And if you're all doing the U course, you'll know that U just takes that as analytic. To have a desire is to have a reason for action. Indeed, all of analytic philosophy that uses a kind of Humean philosophy of mind thinks that to have a desire is to have a reason for action. And Hegel saying, absolutely not. Since desires in what we desire is part of our understanding of who we are, that is, how I understand what I desire and what I most desire is part of who I take myself to be. It follows that the master-slave dialectic as an abiding form of self-understanding and social interaction creates a context where we are continually reflecting on who we are and who we want to be and transforming it in accordance with our understanding of the situation, namely what the master wants. If the master suddenly wants a pyramid, then suddenly I have a great desire to build pyramids. And then I take myself to be the kind of being who is a pyramid builder. And then I have ideas about the pyramid. And I say to the master, look, this pyramid thing works better in steps. And the master, because the master's never done day's work in his life, has to listen to me and say, yeah, that's what I want. I want a pyramid with steps. So the master is having to acknowledge his dependence on the slave, and the slave is transforming his self-understanding through reshaping himself and his social context. But this dynamic relationship does not take place in an idealistic vacuum with nothing but fear and desire and self-evaluation at its elements. The stabilization of repression of desire prepares the way for the social appropriation and transformation of nature. By transforming, as I suggested last week, the forest into the farm, we give human shape to the world. So when I repress my desire for this object, I am also repressing it as the given object of my desire. That is, now we're talking about, I said we have to give up, overcome nature within. We also have to overcome nature without. And that, Hegel says, is the business of work. So desire done, action done under conditions of repressed desire, actions done by acting on the desires of another, Hegel calls work. Hegel states that the experience of slavery is the dissolution of everything stable, not only in principle. In the slave's service, he brings this about. I'm quoting. Through his service, he rids himself of his attachment to natural existence in every single detail and gets rid of it by working on it. Gets rid of it by working on it. Now, the working on it is working on himself and working on the thing. So the experience of slavery is the transformation of random and chaotic activity into specifically human work. Work is the socialization of the human capacity for intelligent activity. But without the discipline of servitude, activity could not be transformed into work. You're not going to do your homework unless you're going to get punished if you don't. You're not going to clean out the, all the reasons that we are forced to discipline our activities. that there is no learning without discipline. So work is discipline. Discipline occurs through the repression of desire and acting on the desire of another. So what makes work work for Hegel is it's being done for another. So if all desire is the other's, then my action is also, in a sense, the action of another. But also, as we'll see, mine. So Kojève nicely says, the slave who works for the master represses his instincts in relation to an idea, a concept. Give me a pyramid. How about a cannon? A palace. A really tasty sandwich. And that is, so each of these, I want to say, are ideas that are invested with meaning. And they're invested with meaning via their mediated character, right? It is because the master wants them that you have to figure out the meaning of what would satisfy that desire. So, and it is just this, acting in accordance with an idea, a concept, that is what makes his activity specifically human activity. I'm still quoting Kojève. By acting, he negates, he transforms the given nature, his nature, and he does it in relation to an idea, to what does not exist in the biological sense of the word, in relation to an idea of a master. That is an essentially social, human, historical notion. Hegel says work, on the other hand, is desire held in check, fleetingness staved off. In other words, work forms and shapes things. Through the structured repression of desire and service for another, the self's desires and acts are socialized. Through the slave's formative activity, nature is transformed in accordance with human desires and ideas. Hence, the experience of slavery is the beginning of the overcoming of nature within and without. We've actually entered into the domain of the spiritual. That is, we've entered into a domain where authority is not the authority of nature, but the authority of ideas, values, meaning, etc. Yeah.
Question. In what sense is this genuine interest in Jesus last week? Because it seems a lot of this is still, I mean, and even your reference to Descartes earlier, evil genius, paranoid subject. Fear of death doesn't necessarily indicate an actual threat of death, and it seems that the master-slave relationship can be related between subject and a God who never appears. So, in what sense is it intersubject?
But two people.
But no, but only one person has to live. There's no actual.
No, there are two people. We're talking about two people.
But it's not necessitated.
Yeah. This is what's necessitated.
Whereas, well, I don't see. That's what I'm asking. I don't see the necessity of the second person.
I will get there. That helps. I mean, of course, this battle for life and death is between two people. right? And therefore the battle can't end. I mean, all of that is about two people. But I'll get to why the structure, the master-slave structure itself requires two people. The way of getting there is to ask the question, why on earth is this an account of self-consciousness? And in what sense is this structure a structure that is both inter-psychic and intra-psychic, both social and internal, both social and individual? And why must it be both, and what makes it both? And in order to get at this, I actually want to use oddly enough, but for reasons that we'll come to, I want to adopt a characterization of self-consciousness of an explicitly empiricist kind from Harry Frankfurt. And the reason I want to begin with an empiricist account is because the problem with rationalist accounts is they already have the two structures going. And the great thing about empiricists is they are always trying to generate all the complexity out of one level of phenomena. So Frankfurt, in a famous paper called Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person. How many of you know this paper? Is this familiar? Just a few. You all ought to know it. This is a really standard piece of analytic literature. He's the guy who wrote the book on bullshit. Same guy. Interesting analytic philosopher. Interesting Descartes scholar, too. Frankfurt suggests that the possession of states of consciousness and corporeal characteristics are shared by many creatures other than human beings. Lots of animals are conscious and have bodies. And therefore, the possession of two types of predicates, consciousness and bodily predicates, does not separate the human from the non-human, the spiritual from natural beings. What demarcates persons as unique, he says, is the possession of what he calls second-order volitions. So here's the idea. I'll quote Frankfurt and then I'll elaborate. He says, besides wanting and choosing and being moved to do this or that, human beings also want to have or not have certain desires and motives. They are capable of wanting to be different in their preferences and purposes from what they are. No animal other than man, however, appears to have the capacity for reflective self-evaluation that is manifested in the formation of second-order desires. Okay, so the story is this. We all have first-order desires. We desire this or that. But now there comes a question. Do I want to have, do I desire to have the desires I have? So, I'm really puzzled. So in my case, right, I certainly have always a perpetual desire for a cigarette. And of course, I would desire that I not have that desire. So Frankfurt's thought is that we have to separate freedom of the will from freedom of action. Freedom of action, which is what Hume talks about, is simply being able to do what I desire without coercion. So I am free to act if I am not impeded from pursuing the desires I have. I have freedom of the will, however, only if I have the desires I desire. Now, what's important here is this. I want to get this structure in its deepest possible way. Under what conditions can I call a desire mine? So I'm interested here in what makes anything mine. My action, my desire. And we know that there has been, from the beginning of this chapter, a question of mineness. We started out with desires, and I wanted all the world to be mine. And it turned out it wasn't mine, right? The mineness that I thought I possessed in desiring kept getting impeded, that it was not mine. So we're now saying that there's a question about what makes a desire of mine mine, and the answer that Frankfurt gives is I can call a desire mine if and only if I desire to have that desire. Otherwise, it is like being haunted, and this is why this is a wonderful case of how it counts for addiction, lack of self-control, bad habits, all the terrible things we do, right? Where we want to say, that's not me acting. Well, it's sort of me and not me. Both, but notice that the notion of mineness is now beginning to get very complicated. So something about having a relationship to my own desires turns out to be, that is, having a self-conscious relationship to my desires, turns out to be a necessary condition for thinking of them as mine at all. So, unless a person, and now these two things now go together with the two springs of action theory, because if I had only desires, but not second-order desires, then there'd only be instrumental reason. To have the capacity for reflective self-evaluation, be able to ask the question, are these desires mine? Are they worthy of me? Are they worthy of anyone? Or so on and so forth, means we have a second form of reasoning, namely ends reasoning, reasoning about ends themselves apart from the desires that are given. Step one. Step two. Frankfurt presents the capacity for reflective self-awareness monadologically. He just takes it as, that's the way folk are. He has a wonderful account of wantons. Wantons are the kind of beings who don't care what their desires are. Right? So roughly everyone under 6 is a wanton. And it's what's terrifying about children, right? It's that the thought that there's a question about whether they should want their own desires just doesn't arise, right? And of course, when you find it in adults, say every narcissistic male you've ever met, then right, it's the same terrifying experience. Okay. So I think this idea of reflective self-evaluation. Now, individuals, which are persons, have these second-order desires, and hence they have the capacity to act on them. That's second-order volitions. That is, to will, to have a certain will. In commenting on Frankfurt's thesis, another reductivist, Daniel Dennett, says the following. He says that as opposed to any first-order desire, that is, doing something to bring it about that one acquires a first-order desire, he says, is acting upon oneself just as one would act upon another person. One schools oneself, one offers oneself persuasions, one stands toward oneself, and access to oneself in these cases is essentially the same as one stands toward and access to another. Self-consciousness is consciousness of self as another may have it. And this requires that we logically distinguish acting on first-order desires from acting on second-order desires. We might say that acting on first-order desires is unequivocally first-personal, while acting on second-order desires is third-personal. And hence we are in relationship to ourselves in the relation of both the first and third person, both subjects and objects. Well, what's missing here is that Frankfurt says this occurs just as if, magically, one were acting on another person. For Hegel, and indeed for all developmental psychology and psychoanalysis, one cannot take an objective stance toward oneself, one cannot take the stance of another toward oneself, unless another has already taken that stance toward one. That is, discipline is something we do not easily submit to. One learns to school oneself by first being schooled by another. In order to act on second-order desires, one must first learn to repress first-order desires, and it is through recognition of this dependence on the other which affords persons this possibility. So the capacity for self-evaluation occurs through the discipline provided by the experience of slavery. And acting on ends that are not one's own. And really the simple answer is they can't come from anywhere else because there is nowhere else. There is no God. I mean,
there is no God. I'm not saying. I mean,
No. But you can't even have an idea of God before you have other people. There is no God. We are the source of the ideas of God,
sure,
and we have to explain them. We have to explain it, and we're going to explain it when we get to the unhappy consciousness. The idea of God is a late version of the dual consciousness. God is one half of our divided consciousness. But it's our divided consciousness. Our divided consciousness. We have to begin where we are. You can't just imaginatively cook this stuff up.
It just seems like it could be a product of fear. You know, the fear of death, which is baseless fear. I mean, I still don't. The necessity of somebody actually attacking you or somebody being a threat to you is not necessary.
I think you're forgetting you were once a baby. You were once a child. This is why I started at the beginning by saying you must, in order to see the structure of this, you must put it back into a developmental psychological account of socialization, how people develop these structures. So, of course, and I want to insist with you, that God's going to play a terribly important role. The unhappy consciousness is going to be the structure of most of Western subjectivity. But it is itself a structure, it's a displaced formation of self-consciousness, not its source. It's what we do with self-consciousness in its hobbled form. So we have to be able to account for it, explain it. So it has to have explanatory power. So the simplest explanation of how we can act towards ourselves like another, I'm suggesting, is because another did it. That's the simplest explanation. And remember the methodologically, our rule is argument for the simplest explanation. Not the only explanation, the simplest one. I haven't ruled out demons, angels, hallucinations, but in fact this actually coheres with human experience. It's the simplest explanation. So, the thought here is that acting on ends that are not one's own. One learns that ends are not given, first-order desires, irrevocably. Effective desires can be altered and eliminated, and different desires can be generated. Master and slave are not simply social roles. They are functioning features of self-consciousness itself. So mastery and slavery can be components of self-consciousness only because self-consciousness, and this is the thesis, is neither an individual capacity nor a social role, but the primary mode in which individuals act as social beings. Let me give you an example. Simple example. Master says, I want a grape. Slave goes off to the kitchen, fridge, gets the grape, gives it back, gives it to the master. Who acts? Only the slave? I mean, there's a sense in which, and this is Hegel's claim, every human action is a we act. Remember, it's an I that is a we, and it is a we that is an I. And I want to say about the master-slave now, every action of master or slave is exactly that. Every action is a we act, and it is done by an individual. But because that individual is already mediated in relationship to itself, because I is another, because my desires are the desires of another, then my act is a we act. There is no I without the we. So the notion so we get, this is where Lacan gets his kind of fundamental little theorems. The I is an other. Well, that's because when I act, it's the other who acts through me. And when the other acts, or, again, this is from Lacan, from a creed, the ego is always seen by the eyes of another when it looks at itself, since without this other, that is its image, it would not see itself. We are ourselves in otherness. It's going to be a huge theme later on. Okay. I've got 2 or 3 more steps here before I go to Derrida. We've been going for. Can I keep going, or should we have a break? You have patience for another kind of 10 minutes?
Sure.
Sure? Someone said sure. Okay, let's do that, and then we'll make some enemies. I think you just made a lot of enemies. Sure. Okay. It is only another kind of 7-10 minutes. Okay. Hegel's analysis has one further distinguishing feature. Still trying to think about mindness here. Frankfurt and Dennett treat reflective self-awareness as simply an abstract capacity. Hegel demonstrates that the capacity for reflective self-evaluation is embedded in the transformation of random activity into work. I haven't yet gone on to this thing. This is where I'm heading. The building thing. And this, in a way, makes perfect sense. One cannot theorize different orders of desire, first order desire, second order desire, reflective, different springs of action. Right? I'm trying to understand how there are two orders of action. One cannot theorize that without the differential modes of activity which relate to those desires. And to theorize work and desire is also to theorize the objects of work and desire. The socialization of nature within us is mediated by and mediates the socialization of nature without. Learning to repress first-order desires is learning to repress the given, both within and without, and that involves learning that activity not only changes, alters, and destroys things, it makes, forms, and shapes new things, things never imagined. And when we do that, when we form and shape, when we make things, we are giving objective actuality to our interior life. So Hegel says, the shape the slave produces, the shape, the gestalt the slave produces, does not become something other than himself through being made external to him. Think about what it is to make something. You make it. Right? You externalize it. In externalizing it, does it become something absolutely other than you? On the contrary, Hegel says, for it is precisely this shape that is his pure being for self, which in this externality is seen by him to be the truth. That is, he creates something independent of the authority of nature. He creates an artifact. And the creation of that artifact, in seeing that, for the first time, he sees his independence from nature. The very thing that he could not achieve in the battle, right? Freedom from the authority of nature, he gets or begins to achieve through work. Because making a human world in accordance with ideas is beginning to produce things that are exactly human in their shape and form. But with one problem, of course. Namely, master owns them. That's going to cause problems. We'll come back to that problem. It's why there is Stoicism, skepticism, and happy consciousness. Because he does this, he achieves a certain type of independence, and yet does not at the same time. Right? It's like being an adolescent. Right? Both free and self-moving and completely under the grip of a tyrannical master. I had a bad adolescence. So, the objects are making a building of the world, and that world is a reflection of me. So it is a building of the subject, a learning process, by means of which the subject is formed into something different than he was at the beginning. This is why. So now, as Pinkard rightly says about this, the slave is now in a position to reflect on his own activity and to see that the natural objects of the world count as things of worth only to the extent that he, the slave, integrates them into a scheme satisfying desire. Mine. It's just that it's not his desire. But anyway, satisfying desire. And in doing that, the slave constructs a social, quasi-objective point of view out of his subjective point of view. So, and furthermore, as I've already mentioned, the master must coordinate his desires with the slave now, right? Yeah, I want what the slave wants. So the necessity, notice the necessity here that the master and the slave have to coordinate themselves, hence the necessity for a common objective point of view is established. Not the existence of one, but the necessity of a common and objective point of view. That is, if there's ever going to be a world without only masters and slaves in it. Point one. Point two. Hegel, at the end of the chapter, wants to understand the push of this necessity, and therefore goes back to the question of the fear of death, which is where I began this hour. Let's call it this long hour. So Hegel says at the end of the chapter, as if he had just been reading Being in Time, if consciousness fashions the thing without the initial absolute fear, it is only an empty, self-centered attitude. For its form or negativity is not negativity per se, not being for self-negativity, just doing things isn't negativity per se, and therefore its formative activity cannot give it a consciousness of itself as essential being. Roughly, it's kind of das Mann. Just any old one. That is, unless it does not have a sense of necessity, that is, the authority of death, and the authority of authority, that is, the meaning of self-consciousness, it is just acting out of routine. Hence, in self-consciousness that places it within its sociality. So it's only in relationship to this structure that we can have a reflective relationship to ourselves as to be truly self-conscious beings. Okay, let's have a break. Think about all that. We can see where we are. Questions? Any before we press on? Slog through the form, and that's what say about it. Yeah.
Maybe following up on your earlier remark that you went from the always have these discussions, because it seems that especially in this section where Kantian would have strong problems, because as you outlined it, it seems that in the beginning there was the attempt to establish something like self-centeredness or independence or however one can call it. So it seems to be in a sense an instrumental argument to go through these different steps and show how it doesn't work to once come to something like mutuality. So mutuality is then justified by way of striving toward independence, and it seems that Kantian not really knows much, so that's strong problems with that. So I think
What's the way have a problem?
because it thinks that mutuality has some unconditional request for authority and wants just growing out of the tendencies of independence.
Well, the answer is not yet. I mean, the interesting thing is, so far, if we have Bildung as independence, we don't have anything that tells us we need mutuality for it. What the slave, and I want to be very clear, what the slave wants is to be independent like the master. That's what the slave is striving for still. The slave hasn't got this idea of communism, socialism, or, the slave hasn't read any Axel on it yet. So it's not wanting mutuality and justice and reciprocity. No, it wants mastery. And it turns out that searching for freedom will require us coming up with ideas of mutuality. But mutuality is not there yet.
But the initial starting point is the search for individual self-standing freedom.
Yes.
That seems to be where at least one version of Kantianism would have a struggle with that definition of freedom as self-standingness and not as universality and fine.
But I should hope so, because what I've been arguing or urging is ideas are not shot from a cannon. That's Hegel's objection to Kant. Where do Kant's universals come from? Where do categories come from? Where does all this come from? So what we want to see, and this is why I keep talking about Bildung in history, what we want to see that universality is not a given. It's not an obvious idea. It's not born with us, as Levinas supposes. No. It's actually a very late, complicated human accomplishment, and which for Hegel is going to require a lot of Christianity, a lot of Greek culture, and a whole complicated of history. So universality is, I want to say, no, that's fine. I'm glad not to have universality because I want to earn it. So the nice thing is we can understand from the idea of primitive narcissism, of desire, the notion of independence. Independence doesn't yet represent full-fledged self-determining autonomy, although the idea of that's beginning to flicker through in the idea of the master. Right? Because now we know what freedom means freedom from the authority of nature, and that turns out to be something like self-determination, but not quite self-determination, because we're in this complicated social relation. So all of these things, so I'm saying freedom, reciprocity, universality, none of them are there yet. And that's good. That seems to be Hegel's genius, is he doesn't help himself to all the big ideas. He wants to see them emerge as a consequence of a process. So yeah, that's right. My whole and the way I, that's why I brought up Kant at the beginning and said something about the moral law having something like this power of stunning desire. But what does Kant have to do to earn it? The fact of reason. Yeah, well, if there's a fact of reason, everything's Jim Dandy. But there isn't a fact of reason, right? There's the state of nature. There are, narcissistic children. Yeah, we learn this stuff. So yeah, I want to really take seriously the idea of history, human history, as formative of our fundamental desire. And the notion of discipline here, like the way discipline works in Nietzsche, it creates, a lot of eons to make an animal who's capable of keeping promises. Not to take it for granted, but to kind of earn it. Yeah.
You said toward the end that the master starts to see necessity. He wants what the slave wants. But you said at one point the master too wants what the slave wants. Why does that? I know why the slave wants what the master wants. Why does the opposite do?
Because the master says something like, "I want a comfortable palace." And the slave says, "Okay, master, give me something you're comfortable." Well, not so. And then the slave begins to sketch out. He's an architect, or she's an architect, and the master says, "Yeah, I want that. I want the pyramid." So the master begins to have to adjust his or her ideas of what it means to satisfy these given desires through what the slave can produce, or what is possible, or what is offered. So the idea becomes that there's got to be this coordination of their points of view. Otherwise, the slave can't satisfy the master.
Because the slave has the knowledge of the experience of that.
Exactly. The slave's got the noose. Yeah.
More of a clarification. How do we get the split between the notion of life as such, having life in the natural sense, and then the spiritual notion of life, same with death? Because, it seems like the initial encounter between myself and another, as an acknowledgement of another I, presupposes that life and spiritual life are one. And in the encounter is separate. And that's how one person can relinquish spiritual life in order to preserve life, and the other one can experience a spiritual death but still be living.
Right.
And I'm just trying to figure out what's the motor for the split that allows sort of the rest of the story to continue.
Oh, why there are these two attitudes?
Well, more than how do we justify the fact of two attitudes?
Kojève says, and I tend to agree with him. Hegel doesn't. Hegel and Kojève says it is simply necessary that there be these two fundamental attitudes. So Hegel has no explanation. My explanation is put it back into a developmental setting.
But a developmental setting by itself is not going to be something nor history. Right? Because, the chimpanzee still has developmental phase. Right? We need something over and above that.
No, you need a human developmental sequence. You need the authority of parents over children. You need the authority the child's desire to become the father or the mother. So you need, internally to that, I think we can begin to see why, that is, that we begin incapacitated, seems to me essential to making the kind of story work. So I do see there's an argument in a book by Osborne. Why am I forgetting his first name? Peter Osborne, on time, where he rightly argues that, he really makes an argument for psychoanalytic theory. And he goes through kind of versions of it: Freud, Lacan, Kristeva, and Laplanche, who turns out to be his favorite, as working out the details of the master-slave thought. But for Hegel, I think there is no ultimate explanation for the twofold. It's just that's what's necessary to end the battle. That's what that means. So he has a reductio answer, that's all. Simply logical. Nothing else will end the battle.
My question relates back to something that came up earlier. It has to do with the extent to which the absolute fear with which the section closes, which you linked to briefly to Heidegger, as characterized earlier in paragraph 194, can be sort of fully contained within an account of the relationship of two subjects, the master subject and the slave subject. Because it seems as though, certainly in Heidegger, but also in the description of pure negativity in paragraph 194, that the experience of absolute fear, the absolute lord, and seized with dread, is something precisely to the extent that it can't be a fear of anything particular.
Absolutely.
But has to be a more generalizable, so something closer to terror, basically. Yeah. So to what extent can that fear be, so my general point would be that the fear of death of the slave, that sets the slave into the social, could not itself be an instance of sociality.
No, it's not.
Yeah. Okay.
No, what sets it into sociality is just the idea of the no-win situation, of the struggle, right? Once in sociality, he's faced with the master, who is the permanent absolute fear. So no. It's that's the whole idea, that the struggle itself is indeterminate, right? And its meaning is only realized in the context of the institution of the master and slave.
So, but then how does that, so sort of returning to the question that came up here earlier, how does that not then, it seemed as though earlier you were suggesting that this had to be imagined as grounded in a kind of conflict that takes place between two subjects. But if you say that this encounter with an absolute fear and everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations is not social or not is not relational, but sort of non-relational experience, an experience of solitude at its sort of core moment or originary moment, then it seems that even if it's sort of inevitably or irremediably related to this later moment of socialization, the sort of first instance, it seems as though it would have to be sort of imagined differently.
I'm not sure why. I'm not following, because again, what happens is I'm in the battle, and I begin to realize, if I'm the person who's going to become the slave, that this guy's going to kill me, and I'm not going to get what I want, and I'm not going to get what I want if I die, so I need to live. So that's the, so I am literally frightened to death, absolutely, by the battle. That lets me put my neck out and say, I surrender, which I think of as a life-saving mechanism, not realizing that in doing that, I'm actually going to enter into a structure where that fear of death is actually going to haunt me permanently in that structure. And it's the, so it's a kind of no-win situation. I can die or become a slave. That's part of the answer to that earlier question. Necessity. There just no other options. So yeah, it draws me into a being for self, to a moment of solitude. Hegel's not denying there is a radical independence. Remember what I said? Absolute independence and absolute connectedness. That's the structure I'm going for. So yeah, there is a moment of absolute independence. And indeed, when I die, well, we die and I die. We die our own death.
Presumably, the difference between spiritual death and natural death is one is either literal or symbolic.
Yeah, yes.
They're fundamentally the same thing worked out from different perspectives.
No, they're different. Well, it's different being a slave than being dead.
Once I enter into the slave...
No, that's what Derrida hates about this. It's how he's going to hate about it. They're really different. This is why the notion of soul death, Orlando Patterson's great work on this account of American slavery in terms of soul death, is about how a community can be truly traumatized as a community. But that is not literal death, it really is spiritual death.
The point that I wanted to make was that they're both non-relational. If I'm dead, I'm incapable of any kind of relationality. If I'm spiritually dead as a thing, I no longer relate, but I'm related to. Right?
I have to relate because what makes me spiritual dead is I take on the other's view of my worthlessness. That's what's so right. So think about what it is to be utterly demeaned, right? Is in that moment you're looked at as nothing. You're taking in that nothingness. No, it is relational. That's what's terrifying about it. That the others got me. That, I think, is the terror. That it is relational. If it wasn't relational, we could just walk away. But if he's got me, then I don't even realize I can just walk away. One of the things that people always ask political philosophers, and those in the structure, is why don't people rebel? Why are people throughout history, over and over again, passive? Why do they take on such? And of course, there are some instrumental things. People have necessities. But there is something about this structure that I really do think this captures a deep structure of how we can internalize the other's view of our worthlessness and live it. So no, I do think it's relational. That's the hard bit of it. And it's also, the reason that this is why I think both Orlando Patterson and people like Butler and Benjamin try to think of problems of race and gender, histories of sexuality, using this structure, because it's trying to understand how whole collections of people in different ways have, through long epochs of history, accepted subordination of various kinds. including absolutely, gross domination. And it's not mere force, clearly. So Hegel's digging at, or trying to dig at, those structures in which we internalize as a necessary condition for our self-understanding others' views of us. And he thinks this particular structure, he thinks, just tracks throughout history in various ways. And we're going to see there are versions of it. Stoicism, skepticism, they have to be consciousness, that themselves are permanent parts of the repertoire of human self-understanding. So that's my hunch. That's my hunch. That's why, why I, amongst feminist theorists, I'm a kind of Beauvoirian. Why in race theories, I like Orlando Patton, all the good Hegelians. They seem to me to capture things that other accounts can't quite do. But that's and there may be further problems. We'll talk about that next semester when we do the Antigone. A lot of these problems come out there. Questions? Okay, let's do a fast Bataille Derrida. And then after Thanksgiving, there is no class next week. So if you come, you'll be lonely. Let me do this. First of all, the last thing is you'll see I want to do is refute Derrida or Bataille. I don't think that's a way of taking on really serious criticisms or handling them or worrying about them in an adequate way. For reasons I'll come to in a moment, I'm going to look at Derrida more than Bataille. Doing Bataille would take a lot longer and more complicated analysis. The reason why that's the case is that much, if not everything, in Bataille is based on him believing Kojève, believing that Kojève argues that at the end of the Hegelian story, history comes to an end. History stops. There are no further sets of fundamental human ideas about what it is to be human that are ever going to occur. It's done. It's finished. It's over. And this thought of Kojève's, that history is fundamentally over, Hegel got it right, there's no more experience, nothing further is ever going to happen, hence there could no longer be significant negative action that truly negates and therefore no more buildable. And this again is repeated, as most of you know, in Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, which is how we got into Iraq. That's another story, another class. Worth following that. Wolfowitz bought this line, bought the Fukuyama line, and thought that the Iraq strategy belonged to that. So this stuff keeps going. But Bataille is thrown by this. And therefore, for him, and so, and to get an idea of how radical this is for Kojève, there's a famous footnote on pages 159 to 161. It's an endless footnote, where Kojève's wondering, if history ends, what do we do? And he assumes we don't make war in Iraq, although he probably would have supported it, I suspect. What is life after history like? And his answer is, he said, I figured out what it was on a visit to Japan. It's like a Japanese tea ceremony. That is ritual behavior, done for ritual reason in a way that is perfectly satisfying. So at the end, so post-historical Japanese civilization undertook ways, he assumes that Japan is post-historical, undertook ways diametrically opposed to the American way. No doubt there were no longer in Japan any religion, morals, or politics in the European or historical sense of these words. But snobbery, in its pure form, created disciplines negating the natural or animal, given which in effectiveness far surpassed those that arose in Japan or elsewhere from historical action. That is, from warlike and revolutionary fights, or from forced work. To be sure, the peaks, equally nowhere else, of specifically Japanese snobbery, the no theater, the ceremony of tea, the art of bouquet and flowers, were and still remain the exclusive prerogative of the nobles and the rich, but in spite of this persistent economic and political inequalities, all Japanese, without exception, are currently in a position to live in according to totally formalized values. Poor Bataille goes, "Oi there! I want life! I want experience! I don't want a tea ceremony!" So Bataille, and lots of other people who went, were just horrified by this thought of the end of history. It made our life seem small, informal, and ritual, and empty. And therefore, the notion of pure excess, the experience of non-meaning, the notion of jouissance, all these Bataillean ideas are trying to recuperate a notion of experience after the notion of historical experience has ended. That's what they're about. Now, the reason I'm not going to address them directly is that they could not be more anti-Hegelian with thought of the end of history. Hegel says at the beginning of the Phenomenology, in the preface which we have not read, paragraph 11, besides, it is not difficult to see that art is a birth time, a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world that is hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past in the labor of its own transformation, etc., etc. And then he says, the gradual crumbling that left unaltered the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst, which in one flash illuminates the features of the new world. Hegel thinks there has not yet been human history. And all history has been prehistory, because all history has been done without human freedom. So we do not yet know what it would be to live historically, that is, to live as truly self-determining beings in self-determining states. So far be it from Hegel to think that history is over, he's trying to argue that prehistory is coming to an end, and we might yet be lucky enough to live historically, but he doesn't know what that's going to be. And he does point to America. Right? They'll figure out what history is over there. So this anxiety about the end of history, we will come back to it, because we're going to talk about absolute knowing, but at least it's problematic. It certainly doesn't mean quite what Bataille thought it meant. That's all I want to say about that. Nonetheless, of course, Derrida can collude in the ideas of the dualisms between philosophy and non-philosophy, of meaning and excess, of work completed versus jouissance, all these ideas, because for Derrida, these terms can all talk or address the idea of the closure of metaphysics and the problem of modernity as presence. Hence, what Derrida does with Bataille is try to show that Bataillean notions operate a deconstruction in the precise Derridean sense of the Hegelian totality. Well, what do I mean by that? Structure is the problem for Derrida. This one right here. Why? He says that in the struggle for life and death, Hegel says that the combatants both have to learn that biological life and biological death would be empty and meaningless. It doesn't give the slave to be or the master to be what they want. So Hegel, I'm quoting Derrida now, calls this mute and non-productive death the one that happens before the introduction of spiritual life and death. Hegel called this mute and non-productive death, this death pure and simple, abstract negativity, in opposition to the negation characteristic of consciousness, which cancels in such a way that it preserves and maintains what is sublated, and thereby survives its being sublated. In this experience, self-consciousness becomes aware that life is essential to it as pure self-consciousness. Next sentence from Derrida. Burst of laughter from Bataille. Well, none of you laughed when you read that, but Bataille did. Why? Through a ruse of life, that is, of reason, life has thus stayed alive. Another concept of life has surreptitiously, spiritual life, another concept of life has surreptitiously put in its place to remain there, never to be exceeded, any more than reason is ever exceeded. So the problem of natural death is simply put aside, and we begin to worry about spiritual death and spiritual life. Right? And this life is not natural life, the biological existence put at stake in lordship, but an essential life that is welded to the first one, holding it back, making it work for the constitution of self-consciousness, truth, and meaning. Such is the truth of life through this recourse to Aufhebung, to sublation. So natural life is preserved and sublated in spiritual life, and spiritual death, natural death, is preserved and sublated in spiritual death. He says these conserve the stakes, remain in control of the play, limiting it, elaborating it by giving it form and meaning. Sublation makes death mean. That's what Derrida is worried about. That's what Hegel is worried about. Sublation makes death mean. This economy of life restricts itself to conservation, circulation, and self-reproduction as the reproduction of meaning. Henceforth, everything covered by the name lordship collapses into comedy. So the problem here is the argument is once you buy this story about life and death into spiritual life and death, then there's nothing outside of the Hegelian machine. If Hegel can make death into spiritual death and life into spiritual life, then he's got everything working so that it can mean something for something else. And that's what he means by a restricted economy, a closed system. Hence, Derrida says, laughter alone exceeds dialectics and the dialectician. It bursts out only on the basis of an absolute renunciation of meaning, an absolute risking of death, what Hegel calls abstract negativity. A negativity that never takes place. Notice this is pure Derrida, because he's worried. Derrida, all deconstruction is a deconstruction of Husserlian phenomenology. Derrida only has one interlocutor, that's Husserl. Hence, when he says the next sentence, you get the moment he's criticizing, which is always Husserl, because he thinks Husserl really is the last philosopher. I can explain why, but I'll take another course. He says, absolute risking of death, what Hegel calls abstract negativity, a negativity that never takes place, that never presents itself, because in doing so it would start to work again. So it's the idea that if something phenomenologically shows itself, then we can always recruit it. So whatever it is that's excessive can never be presented. So what is the outside must be what never achieves actual presence, what evades grasp. Hence, he says, for the Hegelian idea, there must be meaning, that nothing must be definitely lost in death, and further that death, natural death, should receive the significance of abstract negativity. So by calling natural death abstract negativity, Hegel's already got a category for it. He's already recruited it. He's already given it meaning. It's the abstract, uninteresting form of death, as opposed to the practical. So he's already making it work. That a work must always be possible, which, because it defers enjoyment, confers meaning, seriousness, and truth, on putting at stake. Hence, the opposition here to this, what he calls on page 259 the blind spot of Hegelianism. Is that what you have? What pages did I give you?
256 and 257.
I gave you 256. Okay, so let me go back to 257 since you had it. So the rest of 257 is going to give you the structure of restricted and general economy. Absolute comicalness is the anguish experienced when confronted by an expenditure on lost funds, by the absolute sacrifice of meaning, the sacrifice without return and without reserves. The notion of Aufhebung, the speculative concept par excellence, says Hegel, is laughable in that it signifies the busying of discourse, losing its breath as it reappropriates all negativity for itself as it works the putting at stake into an investment, as it amortizes absolute expenditure, and as it gives meaning to death, thereby simultaneously blinding itself to the baselessness of the non-meaning. Yes, non-meaning. Which is the basis of meaning is drawn, and which this basis of meaning is exhausted. So he's claiming that there cannot be this system, right, without an exteriority that it does not acknowledge. So the notion here of death is a notion of difference. Laughter is a notion of difference. The blind spot of Hegelianism, he says, and I'll talk about it, around which can be organized the representation of meaning, is the point at which destruction, suppression, death, and sacrifice constitute so irreversible an expenditure, giving out without return, an absolute expenditure. This is the idea of a general economy, right? Not a restricted economy, because you invest and you get nothing back at all. Nothing. Right? So radical a negativity. Here we would have to say an expenditure and a negativity without reserve, that they can no longer be determined as negativity in the process of a system. Well, might we say yes and no? Let me say why no. And then I'll say something about yes. I'll leave it at that. Of course, at the level of content, nothing in Hegel requires, I'd want to argue, or demands or even makes possible the thought that there cannot be absolute laws. The claim that there cannot be absolute laws seems to me groundless. And I'll come back to that thought. What is true, methodologically, is that the text exhibits, and I want to be clear what the text is doing. What the text exhibits are just those moments of actuality that have been formative and hence by definition have been invested in. Right? Hence, by definition, those moments that we have indeed profited by. So that's what the text is interested in, is actually just examining those moments, all of them, that we've learned something from, that do mean something to us. This is not a book about everything. It's a book, a narrow book, that looks at those moments through which we have learned who we are and how we become who we are. Now, in this fact, there is no necessity of progress. There is no necessity of progress in faith. Although there is, he thinks, the fact of progress. It need not have happened, but it has, he thinks, and he thinks he understands what that progress is. Progress of freedom, we'll find out. But, to give you a kind of contrast, there is no necessity in and of itself that we had to learn something fundamental from the terror of the French Revolution. And this is going to be one of those points in the text where we'll argue about this whole question of having the terror and then learning from it. It's a puzzling experience. But Hegel thinks that we cannot make sense of the last movements of Western society unless not only the French Revolution, but the Terror have significance for us, that they actually do mean something. Namely, we did learn, and what we learn matters to who we are because we learn that the demand for freedom cannot be satisfied immediately. That is, the idea of perfect freedom or ideal freedom is an impossible idea, which is how he understands the Terror. Terror is the purity of the desire for freedom. And therefore, it forces us to think about mediation. But there have been genocides from which we've learned nothing. I cannot think of anything that's been learned from Rwanda. And there's a wonderful argument by Jeffrey Alexander trying to think of various large traumatic experiences, that the rape of Nanking has been strangely unfecund in any social response. It just looks like a slaughter that is historically meaningless. What should happen? So, the statement of factuality, progress has happened, entails something about Hegel's method. And this is what I want to kind of think about. Hegel's journeying subject at every stage of experience takes some configuration of reality, some form of consciousness, to be absolute, only to discover that that defining configuration excludes something important. And as we've seen over and over again, whatever is excluded by a form of consciousness returns. There's always a return of the repressed. So that we called that earlier the causality of fate, right? You set up a structure, it has an exclusionary character. Whatever you exclude reverberates on the structure and undermines it, comes to haunt you. And that can occur tragically or comically. I'm not going to have time to do the comedy, but I take the unhappy consciousness to be absolute comedy. I think it's an hysterical section. You will read it and wonder about my sense of humor. But Hegel's really trying to be, I think, comical there. He finds it funny. But he finds asceticism funny. He says something about his sense. But anyway. Okay, but what all this entails is that methodologically, the journeying consciousness is continually forfeiting itself and discovering its exteriority. Something that it is in relationship to that it could not acknowledge. And I want to put it that way because I want to say that that's what this book is about. That self-consciousness is continually discovering its exteriority. I mean, here in our argument, I'm suggesting, no, there's really an exteriority. And we're going to try to deny it, and it's going to come back and kick us in the ass. And this happens over and over again. So it seems to me this book is exactly about dependence and exteriority. I take whatever deconstruction means, it means to capture a moment of absolute exteriority. That's why he's against closure, right? He wants, what Derrida wants, people misread Derrida. Derrida wants world. He wants the touch of the world, and for philosophy not to think it can simply corral it, but philosophy has to acknowledge its dependence on world, its exteriority to itself, philosophy's exteriority to itself. Right? That's what Derrida is fundamentally concerned with. A kind of moment of impossible realism. That's what difference is for Derrida. That's what the laughter is. That's what the death is. Moments of absolute exteriority that are not given their place or meaning by the system, but we only can have system in relationship to them. Right? That's Derrida's thought. That's the thought of deconstruction. And I'm suggesting that that's also part of Hegel's thought, which I think Derrida knew. But here's the thing. If an exteriority were not my exteriority in relationship to me, it could not mean anything. So, on the one hand, I want to say, in this respect, every form of consciousness undergoes a kind of deconstruction. That's what you may say the phenomenology is. A series of deconstruction of forms of consciousness in which consciousness bumps up against another it cannot assimilate. Of course, at that moment, another form of consciousness arises that then assimilates that other moment and puts it to work. But this is not, transparently at least, trying to assimilate the other to the identical, to the same, to presence. Because in order to assimilate what is other, the self must undo previous formations and acknowledge, and that's the trick, to acknowledge exteriority. So each sublation, you might say, is both appropriation and expenditure at once. At which point Derrida will explode. I've had the argument with him. He did explode. I never convinced him. He will say the whole process surely is for the sake of appropriation. And expenditure is always subordinate to it. At which point, I don't want to try to answer him. I want to make two comments. First, the final word in the phenomenology is not totality, but infinity. Secondly, in a fascinating essay, commenting on an essay by Joe Flay, criticizing Derrida. Judy Butler, the very last passage, says the following. She says, if dialectics suppresses laughter, could it be that laughter catches its breath, as it were, in a moment of necessary self-conservation? What kind of exhalation indeed, psyche, is this that frees itself from temporal determinacy? So she's asking the question, what would be a moment, this moment of exteriority, that lacked temporal determinacy. I wonder, she goes on to say, whether the self-consciousness that seeks to risk its life at the outset of the master-slave dialectic does not represent the project of total and unrecoverable expenditure that Bataille seeks, and whether a phenomenological narrative would not reveal that self-sacrificial laughter is one subject to its own ironic reversal. Perhaps, she concludes, skipping a lot, he could only laugh while risking his life in a total expenditure because he has not yet learned the key Hegelian lesson about life, namely that it requires continued and determinate form. So the question that Butler's asking is whether the notion of total expenditure makes sense without some notion of form, even to be non-present. Yeah?
What is that essay?
It's on your reading. These things are all in your reading.
Subjection.
No, it's a response to Joseph Flay on Flay wants you to read. I want to bring you to this. I'll end with this. The last page but one of Derrida's essay, because Derrida, after following Bataille through and saying, "Oh yeah, Bataille operates the deconstruction of Hegel, blah blah blah," and it says, "Wait a minute, how does Bataille do that?" And then he says, this is page 275, he says, Bataille thus can only use the empty form of the Aufhebung in an analogical fashion in order to designate, as was never done before, 5 minutes, right? As was never done before, the transgressive relationship which links the world of meaning to the world of non-meaning. Now, what Derrida's saying here is that Bataille must give form to this. And therefore, for those of you who think about what Derrida does in Violence and Metaphysics, same move, right? He says, sure, Levinas, the absolute other, all that, anti-Hegel. And then he says, wait a minute, you can't have an anti-Hegel without an alter ego. So Derrida never, as it were, thinks of these moments of exteriority are moments of absolute exteriority. They are moments of, they form a kind of critical reminder about what exteriority is and what meaning is and about what dependence is. Now, if that's what he's doing, then are we that clear or that sure that he's actually doing anything different than Hegel? Have a nice Thanksgiving. We will begin with Stoicism, Skepticism, and the Unhappy Consciousness. And remember when you read it, it's funny. Can't really say that, can you? Can't say it. Remember, it's funny.
Did you see Lois on